and our guest today is someone who specializes in, well, the genres are difficult, but you could call it sci-fi, you could call it speculative fiction, a lot of different things. Lavanya Lakshminarayan is the author of The 10% Thief, first published in India as Analog Virtual. I finished it about, actually, this is the book, Analog Virtual. In case you haven't got it, you should check it out. And it was a lovely read. It was a fun read. I enjoyed it. So I would highly recommend it to all of you. She's the first Indian woman to be shortlisted for the prestigious Arthur C. Clarke Award and is currently the finalist for the Subjective Chaos kind of award. She's also a Locus Award finalist, the winner of the Times of India AutHer Award and the Value of Words Award. Her short fiction has appeared in a number of magazines and anthologies, including the Big Book of Cyber Punk and the Best of World SF Volume 2. Lavanya is occasionally a game designer and has built worlds for Zynga, Inc.'s Farmville and Mafia Wars, amongst other games. Her next novel, that's interesting name, is Interstellar Mega Chef, releases this November. For more, follow her on Instagram and Twitter. So we can veer our conversation more towards spec-fic and towards sci-fi if you guys want. If any of you are writing spec-fic or sci-fi, make sure you put your questions in the chat and we can go through all of them. The one thing I do want to mention is that there's only been one other nominee for the Arthur C. Clarke Award until now in the history from India, and that was Amitav Ghosh, and he got his nomination for Calcutta Chromosome. So unfortunately, the award has been won by somebody else, but even making the shortlist of the last 5 books is a phenomenal achievement. So yay, congratulations, Lavanya.
Thank you so much.
Sure. So let's start by talking about spec-fic and your journey. So tell us how you landed up into writing, and what does writing mean to you, and what is this whole choice about? It's a choice, very clear.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Chetan, for inviting me to be here. It is lovely to be chatting with all of you today. And please ping your questions while we're talking. I would love to address them. I always wanted to be a writer. I remember just being enamored by the world of story. When I was very young, I had parents who would read to me, who encouraged reading books of all sorts. We were never censored, and this is India back in the 90s and early 2000s, where you didn't have these categories of children's books only. And, you can't read this until you're 13 to 18 years old and so on. So I grew up reading across the board, whether it was truly, children's fiction, nonfiction, literary fiction, the classics, science fiction, fantasy, poetry. I've always loved sort of just being able to sit in a room and somehow travel worlds beyond the one that I belong to. So when I was very young, I decided I wanted to be a writer. I think I might have been 8 or something, that first composition in school that they make you write, which is myself. And there's always a, when I grow up, I want to be sentence. And I remember writing, I want to be an author at that point. I was always tinkering with stories. I had notebooks when I was a kid, filled with fiction. And when I was 13, or maybe, it was between the ages of 10 and 12, that I stumbled into the magnificent world of J.R.R. Tolkien and read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I wound up discovering Isaac Asimov and Sir Arthur C. Clarke, and there was no looking back after that point. I just knew I wanted to invent new worlds. And the reason I wanted to invent new worlds is because it struck me that in these completely fantastical spaces, without the baggage of the contexts we live in, one can really look at what makes us human. One can reflect these contexts, but without the sort of pre-existing biases that surround them, right? You can reflect injustice, but you can reflect injustice without the accuracy of history, where when you're a reader, suddenly it's an objective perspective that you have to adopt, where you have to kind of, nobody is telling you that this is the British colonizing India, for example. Here is a colonizer. Here is a subjugated, a subjugated people. So regardless of where you are in the world, you can reflect upon the ills of oppression and colonization, and it doesn't feel personal. But you learn, you grow, and you learn how to empathize with different types of situations when you don't always have the historical trappings that surround you. And I think that's what has always fascinated me about speculative fiction, being able to play with the rules of reality a little bit, and then introduce a conversation that might otherwise be it's always an uncomfortable conversation to have, but you could enter with far more biases otherwise.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a very that's a perspective I had not thought of earlier, but you're right. Absolutely makes a lot of sense. So from the way you're talking about it, I'm assuming, so sci-fi, and then you're a game designer. So I'm wondering, there's got to be a link, there's got to be a connection there. So did one lead to the other, or what led to what? How did that come about?
Well, it's interesting. I always wanted to be a writer, but I am sure it's no secret that being a writer as a career choice is a very financially risky thing. It is very difficult to graduate straight out of college, say, and then decide, I will just be a writer, because you've got no idea who's going to publish you. And you always know that there is no such thing as economic stability as a writer.
Yeah.
So when I graduated college, right, I graduated at a time when we were still looking at advertising and PR and journalism as the only paths you could take if you had a literature degree. And I have a literature degree. But out of the blue, gaming started popping up in India. And I interviewed as a game writer because, I can write, and they tested my storytelling and they were very happy with me. And so I think, as a very natural output for this need I had to tell stories in me, gaming seemed like a far more financially viable thing to do, to sort of set up this way of self-expression, but without the enormous financial risks involved. And so, I was very fortunate to actually sort of have this opportunity. I think now gaming is a lot more common than it was back then. But kind of stumbling into that, working through gaming, also instilled in me like this demystification of the creative process. As all of you are working on your first drafts, I'm sure you see the amount of commitment and labor it takes to execute a story beginning to end, and it's a long-term process. So there's the romantic notion of writing, which is I have my cup of tea and it's raining outside and I'm inspired. And then there's the reality of writing, which is I need to tell a story. In order to tell a story, it has to happen one word at a time. It's like laying bricks. And working in gaming really equipped me with that capacity to view creativity, not just in its romantic sense, which is of course important, but also in its practical sense, which is you're going to take hours and days and occasionally even a year. But that is the only way to do it. And so, when I'd done this in gaming for a while and I felt confident that I could do it in life, in my other life rather, that's when I started seriously pursuing writing a novel.
Cool. Awesome. And 10% Thief is an interesting novel in the sense that, to quickly clarify, again, if you can see me, this book, the Analog Virtual, is the same book as the 10% Thief, which was nominated for the Arthur C. Clarke. This was released in India in 2020, right, Lavanya?
Yes, that's correct.
This was released in India in 2020 as Analog Virtual, and then the same book was released in the UK as the 10% Thief. Yes. Which is the one that won the Arthur C. Clarke award nomination, the shortlisting, and also a lot of other award nominations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. It's an interesting novel because there isn't one single central character. while the book is called 10% Thief, even the 10% thief is in it for maybe 10% of the time, right? So it's one character story. It's more like one, or the story of two halves of a world, the analog and the virtual world, and how they come together. And so there's lots of separate characters, and they all contribute and they all play a part, and then there's a narrative that comes together very nicely. So when you think of gaming, that's unusual. So I'm wondering, where did that idea come from? How did you land up on this structure, which is so unusual in a game world?
First, thank you so much for your kind words about the novel. When I started writing it, I think I started writing it as a couple of short stories sort of set in the same universe, which is this
Okay.
very extreme universe that is controlled by a corporation. It's run on the basis of merit, where, if you work hard, if you continuously perform, you are evaluated as being far more valuable to society, and therefore given a lot more privilege than if you underperform, in which case you're kind of culled and you become an analog. They're the outcasts of this world, and they pretty much don't have human rights. So I started tinkering with a short story or two set in this world. And when I was writing one or two of these short stories, it emerged to me that these fragments that were coming to me were very deeply inspired by the city of Bangalore that I currently live in, and its transformation over the last 10 to 15 years. I grew up in Bangalore, and it was this very sort of idyllic, almost retirement town in the early 2000s. And then with the advent of Infosys, all the tech culture, I think I started witnessing this very stark cultural shift. In many ways for good, but also in many ways that made me question, the frameworks of how we value society and how we value each other in society. And while these fragments were being, were being articulated on the page in the form of these short stories, I realized that I actually had a novel about a city. So while the novel is told from the point of view of over 20 characters, it is altogether, on the whole, the story of a city at a state of flux and transformation, where the choices of all of these individuals will determine the future of the city. And to me, the city really emerges as the main protagonist in this novel, kind of tying everyone together, because a city is its people. And this is the story of that city.
Cool. Yeah. And a lot of the things, there was a question about names, and we'll come back to the questions as well. But a lot of the things are actually very fascinating, because you've really cued into a lot of things, like calling the big corporation, like Big Brother, Bell Corp, because it's the bell curve. So I think that was just profound. Similarly, there is so many other small nuances which are thrown into the book, which make it so much more fun to read, because you can completely get where the author is coming from. And I think the reader enjoys it. It's almost like having a little secret between the author and the reader that the characters in the book may not even realize. But it's also a commentary on this whole deterministic, achievement-oriented society. And in some ways, it's a reflection on how society is right now, because it's not actually very different from the world we inhabit currently. It's just a little more drastic or extreme how you portrayed it, but it's not too far from our current reality. So was that conscious? I mean, so the city, the book being about the city, or the book being about the characters and the wants of the various characters, and the characters here are not one character. It's almost like the analogs as a race, or as a community want a certain certain something, and that is how the book is set up. So with this whole underdog story playing out very strongly, so was all of that conscious? Was all of that thought through? Did it emerge? How did that come through?
In two steps. So it's I try and plan what I'm going to say going into writing anything that's long form, because it's such a massive commitment. But having said that, this book um, came to me in multiple fragments, because the moment I started writing, that first story, which incidentally it's in the book. It's called, the chapter is titled Analog Virtual, and that's what the book takes its title from as well, the Indian edition. Um, as I was writing it, I started becoming very aware of the extreme technological dependence that we are moving towards as a society, and the kind of capitalist structure from which it is imposed upon us. Because all of the tech that we depend on right now is very much the of big technology. So we have these very capitalist overlords sitting there designing our iPhones and telling us what is aspirational and trying to give us technology for entertainment, which I have also done as a game designer. When there are so many problems facing reality from the ground up, whether it's climate change, poverty, hunger, poverty, right? But these are not addressed on the same scale. So I started kind of listening to the echo chambers in the city around me. Having worked in gaming, I have always had a very behind the scenes look at technology that has been accessible to me, and
Right.
also at the people who make technology. And so I started listening to the people around me a lot more closely through the lens of their relationships with technology and where they were located socially and economically, right? So, extreme examples include, for example, in the gaming industry, you have people who are tinkering with AI and virtual reality, and they've all got the Oculus, and their biggest concern is like glitches and lag when it comes to an animation. But on the other hand, you have people like my domestic worker, whom I got her a smartphone for the first time during the pandemic, because there were lockdowns, cash transactions became impossible. I wanted to set her up with Google Pay to help her out. And just being able to set up a smartphone when you cannot read or write is so difficult. So you start looking, like you said, it is an echo of the world we live in right now, where technology is inadvertently designed for a privileged handful
Yeah.
and exclusionary to anybody who doesn't have social and economic privileges. And we talk about smartphone proliferation, which is high, and absolutely that's a good thing. But the usability of these technologies to actually serve the needs of people who aren't using them to play Candy Crush, um, there's a huge disconnect there. And I think it was amplified by the pandemic, and what we witnessed during the pandemic. But these were all the concerns at the forefront of my mind. And they started trickling in the minute I started listening to the city. And that's how all of these reflections of the city, social disparity, the pursuit of merit, and again, valuing people who are only productive. An example of that is what you see with our delivery app culture right now, right? Like you've got Blinkit promising 3 minutes.
Oh my
Um,
God.
and that's supposed to be extremely high value, regardless of the high stress it's putting those poor delivery riders under.
Yeah.
So, this is what we're valuing. We don't want to view people as people. We want to view people as commodities who can deliver a particular service, a particular experience. And I think there's a problem. There are so many problems arising from it. The biggest of which is a lack of empathy and a lack of, or sort of the reduction in our ability to decenter ourselves. We truly see ourselves as the absolute center of the universe, and we're being trained to. And I think all of this, I know I'm going all over the place, but this is how the book came to me in these waves of observations.
Right. And I think, you're absolutely right, because there are so many, I mean, if you look at themes, there isn't one theme in your book. There are so many themes, and yet you've not kind of, winged it or just kind of scraped the surface. There's even adoption. There is social media pressure. There is peer pressure. There is the prega pod and the whole decision on how to have a baby. So there are so many interesting things. So there is women's rights versus peer pressure. So it's mind-boggling actually to look at the width of things that you've kind of covered in this, and I wish it had won the award.
Oh,
but
thank you.
but but even if you talk about just the social media piece, so you didn't use the names, but you mixed the two and you made one Insta Snap, and then you made the other Woofer instead of Twitter. So that was cheeky and interesting. So did you like consult a lawyer, or did you start with Instagram and then did the lawyer tell you, no, keep it Insta Snap? How did that whole thing come about?
Oh, thank you. No, I wanted it to feel relatable to people, but I
Right.
did want to set it in the future. So I just tweaked the names a little bit.
Okay.
But the naming of, things like InstaSnap and Woofer, I wanted people to have a visual image of what I might be alluding to without
Sure.
having to explain the technology.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
In fact, interestingly, there is a chapter in there called the Bemoji Project, and it's about effectively these life-sized emojis that can be projected onto people so that they can communicate wordlessly. And when I drafted the book, it was actually called the Memoji Project. And when the book was in editing and on the verge of going to print, Apple released a feature called Memojis, which are personalized avatars. And so last minute, I sent this frantic email to my editor saying, Apple's just named it the exact same thing. Can we change the name? And, luckily they let me.
Okay. You should have sued Apple. No?
I know. Maybe
I was
someday.
there first. I was there first.
I know.
So another interesting thing, and then we'll move to the rapid fire round, is your book doesn't have a uniform chapter length. There are 4-page chapters, and then there are 20-page chapters. So there's really a lot of difference or variation in that. And that rule of thumb saying a chapter should be 3,000 to 5,000 words is clearly gone out the window. So did something, I mean, that's a rule of thumb, so it should go out the window. But was there something that drove that decision?
So I will come across extremely naive with this answer. When I was writing it, I just wanted to be true to the characters and their stories. And I know this rule of thumb exists, but at the time I thought, what difference is it going to make? If it reads well, it reads well to an editorial eye. So let me just commit to the integrity of these characters and their stories, and however long they run, that's how long they run. But of course, knowing the longer you stay in publishing, the longer you also realize that this rule of thumb actually really does apply in many ways. So I don't know if I do it the same way, knowing what I know now.
Brilliant books which does not follow that rule. The one that I talk about a lot is All the Light We Cannot See.
Oh yes, beautiful book.
The chapters are like 3-4 pages. There is no long chapter, and none of them makes it to 3,000 words, I think. So that way,
absolutely.
So I think that's a very very workable thing. Okay, so let's jump into the rapid fire questions, and then I'm gonna open it out we'll take the questions that are in the chat. There's lots of questions there already. So the first question, and you have to be very quick. It's a rapid fire, remember. Okay, ignoring awards. What is one piece of writing that you did that you truly take pride
in? There is a short story of mine called Samsara in a Teacup. It's available to read online. And it's about hate speech.
Okay,
and
lovely.
It's satire, so it's
definitely going to check that out. Samsara in a Teacup. So that was my second question: is where can we find it? Can you tell us where online, or if you Google it, it'll turn up?
If you Google it, it'll turn up. It's in a magazine called Apex Magazine, and it's available to read for free online. Okay, that's an interesting coincidence that the magazine is called Apex, because the city in Analog Virtual is also called Apex City. What used to be Bangalore. Okay, who is Lavanya Lakshminarayan's god of sci-fi writing? This is so difficult, but since we're talking sci-fi, I have to go with Ursula Le Guin. Okay. Who is a prolific, wonderful writer from the 60s and 70s who continued to write all the way to the end of her life. I strongly recommend The Left Hand of Darkness, and The Word for World is Forest, both novels by her.
Awesome. Great. Yes, she's a legend in sci-fi, of course. Do you think AI will destroy humanity? Yes, no.
At its current trajectory, yes. If we fix it, we have hope. But right now, yeah, it's absolutely destroying us.
Ooh, okay. Is there a piece of fan mail or a particular fan that you remember very distinctly that you want to tell us about?
So there have been so many lovely ones, truly wonderful people. I love meeting people who've read the book who want to talk about it. But very recently, I did an event in Bangalore, and someone attended the event and came up to me afterwards to chat with me about the book. And she was kind enough to actually wear a purple skirt in honor of the jacaranda tree in my novel. And the jacaranda tree in my novel plays a very big symbolic role in the book and the events in the book. And she wore purple to honor that. And I was so touched by that thoughtfulness.
Fantastic. Fantastic. All right, great. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to open up the questions, folks. And if you have questions, pop them into the chat. The first is from Priya. She's saying, I've already received Interstellar Mega Chef proof copy and I'm excited to read it. So she's one of the proofreading people. And she said, I'm writing fantasy. So no question there. The next one is, why is it like this? 1 minute. Okay, the first thing that is worrying me right at this moment is coming up with names of the cities and kingdoms in my fantasy world. I use some random name generator from the internet, but my university supervisor commented that once the names pique readers' interest, they'll find that they're very random and there's no significance in terms of etymology and or meaning. And they'd feel betrayed. My question is, how do you come up with place names?
Okay, this is tricky. Two bits of advice that I have. One, while drafting, names can be anything because you're always going to go back to edit and revise. So, if you're calling a city, right? While you're drafting, the important thing about a first draft is getting to the end. Having said that, when you do revisit, if this is what you're doing right now, whenever you do revisit to give proper names, I would suggest considering names rooted in the culture that you're writing about. So, for example, if you are very, let's say, if you are Mughal inspired, what names would evoke, that connotation of being Mughal inspired? It doesn't have to be true to history, right? But if you were writing something Mughal inspired, and you could play around with something like, say, a Fatehpur Sikri, right? Or if I were writing something, for example, when I decided to call Bangalore Apex City, the reason behind that was I'd created this very normative globalized world where traditional languages and diversity are dead. They're not permitted. We are English first, and we are an aspirational city. So our entire value is around chasing the pinnacle of success, ergo apex. So, just thinking along things like that could be a great place to start. I hope that helps.
Thank you. That's great. And I should mention that even in the book, for example, there is a Carnatic meridian, and there is characters who are both, there are Kathis, but then there are Bijus and Tanvis as well. So, and Afrins. So it's very true to what Lavanya is just describing, where it is set in the here and now of what we inhabit. Okay, Sunil, I'm going to come back to your question because there's another question like yours. But the second question Sunil has is, did you extensively outline and figure out the details of the new world before you wrote it? Or did you figure it out as you were going?
While I was tinkering with that first short story that I wrote, a lot of the world just, emerged at that point, which was the overarching structure of merit, bell corp, the fact that everyone would be mapped onto a bell curve, productivity, performance would be monitored. That entire sort of skeletal architecture was immediately apparent to me. A lot of the rest just popped up while I was writing very organically.
You had a sort of kind of framework of some sort in place, and then
Yeah. I always end up writing with a structure. It's usually on the skeletal side of things because I enjoy playfulness and being surprised while I'm writing. So I give myself enough to begin where there is sort of a logical framework that constrains the world so that I'm not, off doing complete flights of fancy, right? But within that set of rules, those fundamental rules, anything is permitted. So that's my approach to writing.
okay, great. Gayatri has a question. Do you think there's demand for sci-fi in India? In fact, I feel that it is a niche which has not been discovered and filled enough.
I definitely think there is a space for sci-fi in India. It's currently, of course, not as popular as, let's say, romance or nonfiction, right? But it is a very thriving marketplace. If you look at some of the writers working in it, there's Samit Basu, who's been writing for 20 years, absolute legend. Tashan Mehta, who writes sort of skewing fantasy. She recently won the AutHer Award this year. There are a bunch of short story writers working out of here. There's Prashant Srivatsa, whose fantasy novel was just published. It's called Spicegate. So, there's Indra Das, who's won a ton of awards and also writes fantasy and science fiction. So there are writers working in the space. There are publishers publishing us. And I think there are readers looking to read our work. It's just that there is room for it to grow. And I'm optimistic about it sort of occupying more of a central role in our narratives over time.
So related question, which I want to pop in here, but you published Analog Virtual with Hachette. So was it a particular editor who was very into sci-fi that you landed up with? And can you
I
tell
was
us who
very
that
lucky
was?
to actually, yeah, I was very lucky to find a couple of editors at Hachette, in fact, who were very into sci-fi. My editor on the project, I had two, Palomi Chatterjee and Sabani Premkumar, and they were both absolutely fantastic to work with because they're sci-fi readers, they're sci-fi supporters when it comes to publishing as well.
Great. The next question was really the one that is popping up. That's Sunil again. Can you talk us through the decision to first publish in India and then in the UK, and that too with a new title? Would love to understand your journey with agents, publishers, etc. in India and abroad.
Okay, so the decision to first publish in India was just a simple one. I wanted to put it out in the world and just see what a potential response to it could be. And I decided to start locally with that because publishing overseas is a much longer journey. And that was it. It was just simple. It was, I've written this book. I don't know where to start with publishing. Keep in mind, I came from game design as a background. I didn't know where to start with publishing. I thought, let me start with what's closest and most available and accessible to me. And that's my home in India. So I started off here and I was, very blown away by how kind people were being to the novel over here. And a few reviewers actually picked it up overseas. It resonated with them. And then I thought, okay, this book has more of a global audience as well. So let me attempt to find an agent and a publisher. And so it kind of happened very sequentially between the years 2019 and 2021. The whole India experience of publishing and then the UK experience of publishing. The novel was eventually published in the UK last year. So quite a long journey. To sum it up, I think what I would say is in India, things work very quickly. I found my wonderful agent, Kanishka Gupta, very fast. He was very supportive, really believed in the work. I had my offer from Hachette very soon afterwards, within a few months, which is fast in publishing. The journey into the UK and US was longer because timelines there are more protracted. There are far more people writing in this space. So you just have to be patient and wait it out and kind of keep at it. So, query as many agents as you think might be interested in a work like yours, and just wait for a response, because response times, because of the volume of work they deal with, can often be between 3 to 5 months even. And it's okay. Publishing is a slow industry, and that's the headspace you need going into this entire process.
Great, thank you. Gayatri has more of a comment saying it's very similar. And Gayatri, your question is about the influences. I think Lavanya has already answered that. Ursula, Arthur C. Clarke, all of that. I want to move to the questions. So there's a bunch more from Sunil again. Your books have shifting perspectives, first, second, and third person. What determines your choice? What are you most comfortable about?
So to me, I really think it depends on the character and how they want to be portrayed. I know that sounds a bit esoteric, but when a person does pop into my head, I view them as a person. They have volition, that's the only way to bring them to the page true to themselves. And so I think about how they would like to be viewed. And I think about how much of themselves they would be comfortable revealing, right? Because if you talk about a first person perspective, you are in the character's mind. Third, you can be a little closer. So there's, you can have a closed third perspective. You can have a sort of like a very omniscient perspective. So it really depends on what equation I think I have with the character. And for second, I think, is the character willing to be viewed through a completely external lens? And is the reader going to be able to empathize with this character on the level that, I would hope they would? How intrusive, like if I want to write in second, I want to intrude into the reader's mind.
Right.
And does this character lend themselves to being that intrusive? So that's kind of how I make those decisions when I'm writing.
Second question is, how much do contemporary religion and politics come into your dystopian stories?
Quite heavily. I think, if I'm writing at all about the local milieu, especially in the near future, it's impossible to ignore the reality that we occupy. And so while I might not allude entirely directly to present day events, you will always find a reflection of them in some form or the other.
Right. Last one, why are so many futuristic stories so dismal and pessimistic? Any thoughts?
Well, because, you look at our current reality and we've got climate crisis, we've got the rising far right, we've got wars and genocide and all kinds of things. Having said that, there is also a rise in very optimistic takes on the future, predominantly being published in the UK and the US, not as prolifically perhaps as, the legacy of dystopian novels that we've had over the years, all the way from Philip K. Dick onwards. There has been a lot of, I would say, cynicism regarding the future. And I think it's because of the irresponsible way in which technologies have been developed, the divisive way in which they're always skewed towards privilege and so on. A lot of sci-fi writers historically were very preoccupied with these notions of unequal futures. And I think that's why, as a legacy, there's a lot of very negative or pessimistic SFF out there. But there are also people trying to find hope. So my next novel, for example, after writing dystopian satire, I've decided to write a far more whimsical satire, because I did want to look into more hopeful contexts for humanity.
All right, awesome. What's your world building process? Priya saying, I'm having a hard time coming up with it. I have barely any knowledge of gaming to be able to draw knowledge from. That's not true for most sci-fi writers. So
yes, so Priya, most sci-fi writers don't have any knowledge of gaming, so don't worry about that at all. It's not a prerequisite at all. I think for world building, the important thing to do is to figure out, what story you're trying to tell, who the characters in it are, and then to figure out, what kind of world would support that best. If you are, for example, telling a sweeping saga-esque, I don't know, fantasy story about war and empire, then what historical context would suit that best? And therefore, what are the essential elements that you need? So, for example, if you're constructing an empire, you need an army. Who is inspiring this army? Are we talking about, say, Alexander the Great? Are we talking about Ashoka? Are we talking about Roman conquerors? Right? And I think it's just a sequence of those questions where you say, okay, what if I had a conquest based on the Romans, right? What would I need? Studying other cultures is really helpful. I read a ton of history. I love history. So I'm always looking at the way humanity has structured itself and organized itself across various eras, across cultures. And a lot of that inspires world building.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks. AutHer has another tough one. Whenever I try to write Indian sci-fi, I feel it clashing with traditional tropes of classical sci-fi, which originated in the West. How do you go about fusing these cultures together in a way that works well?
That is an excellent question, and it is something that is always, I would say, part of the process, that struggle, because you are working with a lot of tropes that often convey, I would say, dominant worldviews from the West. For example, things like, say, Cold War paranoia, right? Which we necessarily did not experience the same way. So I have two approaches to this. I think one is to identify that Western context and see whether there are degrees with which you can manipulate it to feel more authentic to the Indian experience. And I don't use manipulate as a negative word, right? I use it as a sort of a playful word where you can tinker with tropes and ideas. So, for example, if we take The Lord of the Rings, which is very well known, if we were to set it in an Indian context, I don't know, would the big bad Sauron be a facet of, let's say, colonization? Would that be an impression of empire? And it's in those tiny ways that you can localize it. I always use a ton of names that are South Asian or Indian, or plays on South Asian or Indian names. The other way to do it is to just assume that Indian culture is the normative culture, to ignore that legacy that we've been handed and to just say, well, this book takes place in India or in an Indian setting. It's inspired by Indian events and Indian history, or Indian futures. And I will be defiant and I will write it in this manner, because I do feel that there is space for those novels or those short stories as well.
All right, great. Gayatri has more of a comment. I read the part where the robot reshapes the man's brain, the part where the guy didn't know about the latest celebrity gossip, but he knows a lot of the things that really matter, and this really hit home for her. Pallavi shared the link to your short story, which I will definitely read. Priya has a question. Is it okay to use existing places, characters, historical, but the world is completely fantastical?
Absolutely. I think you make up the rules of your writing as you go along. So feel free to use existing places. I think there are layers to this approach. You could use an existing place name just as a place name, right? If you look at the number of sci-fi fantasy novels that are set in London or New York, but actually use London and New York as settings where, they're talking about neighborhoods in London and New York, for example. That is one way to do that. Or you could just borrow the name and use it as long, and I would say, just from the perspective of conveying the meaning of that place name, maybe have a couple of hidden Easter eggs. So, if I were to use Bangalore in a city, in a story, a couple of Easter eggs about Bangalore, right? Maybe I'll talk about a lake catching fire here, or I'll talk about rampant development, or maybe being a really green city for all of its ills it still is, or terrible traffic. So that's how I would use place name.
All right, great. Thank you. Just a quick clarification. I realized just now that I think Sunil Bhandari shared his link to a lot of people. So we have about 6 Sunil Bhandaris in the group. So a lot of the questions you answered
Oh,
were from various people and not just from him. So somebody just
okay.
clarified that. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I don't think we have okay. And so Saurabh is writing saying, while I've not read it, soon will. Analog Virtual seems to have multiple themes that are socioeconomic, cultural, requiring deep empathy and sensitivity. Which alternative genre would you have used to weave these themes in a novel? Have you ever thought of writing anything else, or is this just what comes to you? This is just home for you.
So the interesting thing is, I always enjoy speculative themes, so sort of offsetting reality, but I never view it through the lens of labeling it while I'm writing, because I feel like it imposes limits that way. So, for example, when I was writing this, I was pretty much in my head writing a cultural commentary on Bangalore, right?
Ah,
With science fiction elements, because it's set in the future. So plausibly, we're calling it science fiction. Um, I viewed it as satire. When Hachette published it, they marketed it as dystopian. When it went to the UK, when it went to the UK, it was marketed as cyberpunk, which is a science fiction genre that people in the West are very familiar with.
okay.
Um, but when I was writing it, I was not consciously thinking of it as cyberpunk or as dystopian. I was thinking, here is social commentary. Things are not going great. It's a bit of a warning to people. And it's science fiction because I use so much technology in it. But I try not to limit myself by identifying the genre while I'm writing. It's almost as if once I have written, so my next book is in space. It's in the far future, 2000 years in the future, on a different planet. And I consider it now, perhaps having written it, it will be categorized as space opera, which is another science fiction genre, because it's set in space,
Right.
so, but that's all marketing. That's usually not me.
So there's another question from Sunil Bhandari, or one of his clones. Is there an age-related aspect to your fiction? Do you have that in mind when you write? I'm assuming they're talking about the age of the reader.
I think so. And not particularly. I just know that it's probably targeted towards adult readers. Not because there's graphic or mature content in it in that sense, but because I think a lot of the themes I'm writing about are not themes that will necessarily resonate with, say, 16 to 20-year-olds. I feel like you need to have experienced a little bit of the world to be able to really grasp some of the paradoxes and the sort of the social ironies that I'm going into.
Right. Okay. The last question, I think, Gayatri saying, I'm struggling with surnames to be used for my characters. I somehow am very wary of naming them and people feeling that it is author self-insert. Don't know what that means. Sometimes casteism also comes along in the forefront of my mind, whereas the book has nothing to do with it. And I feel that I maybe should be representative with my surnames. Am I thinking too much?
So, I think it's a good thing to be aware of all of this while you're writing. Absolutely. I do feel like the last names, the surnames that you give your characters are really organic to each work that you're producing. So, there might be some contexts in which being more inclusive comes organically to the story. But there might be some contexts in which a character, let's say, comes from a very specific cultural background, right? In which case it is best to reflect that cultural background as opposed to force fit some kind of inclusivity. I think so long as you're aware that, as creators, we are aware that people from all over occupy spaces in our fiction, and we write those people organically. I think that is the best we can do. And we write those people fairly, without biases, without assumptions that everybody has biases that culturally have been inserted into our minds, right? It's just a product of environment. So long as we can recognize that and write people with fairness and write people from a place of integrity and organic sort of space into an organic space in one's short story or novel, I think that is good.
All right, great. The rest is just comments. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. So thank you so much for
Thank you
making
so
the time
much.
for us. And if we have more questions, guys, we'll just have to leave them for a later time, I guess. But right now we don't have much else. So thanks. It's been fantastic having you on the show, on this on the FDC. It's been fantastic reading your book. I definitely want to go and read Samsara in a teacup now. So immediately after this. So
Thank you.
wonderful guidance, and it's always inspiring to talk to people. And all the best for this book getting more recognition, and also for the Mega Chef book. So I'm going to look out for that.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's been wonderful being here. Thank you for having me, Chetan, and thank you all for sending these wonderful questions my way. Thank you.